Now I will show you my palette more closely on Wednesday's video, but for now it's just a piece of foil wrapped over a canvas board. Now when I set up my palette, I will set it up the exact same way every time. I put liquid in the middle, and that should have been shaken up better so that the mixture didn't have a thin area and a thick area, but it'll work fine. When I set up my palette, I will set it up the same exact way every single time, and the reason for that is some of the colors, brown, black, blue, purple, they all look the same when they're on the palette. So if you know it's in a specific place, you don't accidentally grab the wrong one. But you don't need very much paint. You can see the paint I put out. I did not put a lot. A little bit goes a long way. Now the brushes that I'm going to be using today, I've got this stiff brush here. It's a stiff round. I've got a synthetic hog hair bristled filbert there. I've got another synthetic hog hair. This one is a liner brush. And now we can get started. Now I'm going to start this off with 3 colors: raw umber, black, and white. My black and white are Weber's Permalba. The raw umber is Winsor Newton. And I'm going to give us all a headache by how I'm moving my palette, but I want to show you how I'm going to mix the liquid into the paint. I'm loading some of that liquid. That is my mixing medium. Some people use linseed oil. This is a fast drying medium though. I'm kind of mixing my thin and my thick areas. And I'm mixing that in with the paint till I get a fairly thin texture or consistency. I don't want thick globby paint here. This is my base layer. I'm just setting up my values at this point. Once I get that onto the brush, you can see under my easel now, I'm going to start applying that directly to the canvas. I am using a Fredrix Belgian linen canvas board, so it is very smooth. It makes blending really, really easy. The type of canvas that you use will make a big difference. So I've started by outlining the apple so that I get that nice smooth edge, and then I am doing random brush strokes all over the place for the rest of this. Now I am not going to worry about my brush strokes showing because I am going to blend that out with a mop brush later. I still want some of the brushes to show, brush strokes to show, but I am going to soften that up. So you can see I'm using lots of brush strokes back and forth, every direction, long strokes, short strokes. It's important that you get variation when you're going for this type of background. You don't want every single one of your brush strokes to look the same. It'll look really weird. I'm reloading my brush. Now, the reason that I'm doing this in just these 3 colors is for 2 parts. One, doing it in just 3 colors takes away the scariness of, oh my gosh, I don't know what color to blend. I don't know what to use here. We're just getting rid of that altogether right now. All you're worrying about are your values. The second is that it actually makes it way easier for you because you're going to be glazing the other colors on top. You see me do that a lot where I will do the 2-tone or just the black, white, and the one single color to build up my background, or just black and white and then glaze color over it. It really makes it a lot easier, and the results I always have really liked. So again, not really worrying about my brush strokes here, just blocking in the color. Now, one of the things that you need to remember with this, there is nothing you can do to this that can't be fixed. I mean, you have to learn how to fix things, but don't be afraid of the paint. You're not going to hurt anything. Worst case scenario, you paint something terrible and you learn what not to do, but don't be afraid of it. If you're afraid to make mistakes, then you're not going to learn very fast. Now you can see this paint is really thin. I'm not globbing this on there like seriously heavy here. That's one thing that a lot of people will do with oils. It is a thick paint and they won't mix enough mixing medium in with it, and they end up with this thick mixture on the canvas that takes 2 months to dry before they can do their next layer. What I'm doing here will be dry to the touch by the next day so I can work on to my next layer. The liquid that I use is a fast drying medium, so it does allow the paint to dry very quickly. I'm doing the shelf that it's sitting on here, or table, or whatever it is. Now this photo comes from Paint My Photo. I will put a link, if I remember, in the video description. So if you want to paint this one yourself, you can pick that up, or you can just copy mine, either way. So my goal here is mainly just to get paint on the canvas so that I'm not fighting the canvas. That's the other thing that doing the two tones like this, it's sort of an underpainting, and it makes it so that you're not fighting the white of the canvas anymore. So I've got this mop brush. This one is, oh, I can't remember the name of it. I will put a link to that in the video description where I buy them too. There's a website. They're really cheap. They shed like crazy, but they're only a couple of dollars each. When you're painting with oils, you're going to want several of these because you can't just clean them like you can with acrylics and then move on. When they're wet, they don't work. And when you clean them, they can take days to a week to dry, depending on how much paint thinner you get in them to clean, or water, depending on how you're cleaning your brushes. And I do have a video showing you how to clean those brushes. But those brushes, you're going to want to get several of them. And that's one reason I'm still using those instead of the makeup brushes like I've switched to for acrylics. The makeup brushes don't shed as badly, but they are a lot more expensive, and considering how many I need for oils, I've just stuck with these. Now, the other thing that you're going to want to make sure you have when you're painting is Viva or Arviva paper towels. So important. Any other Viva paper or any other type of paper towel, whether it be Bounty or even, I mean, good name brands, they do not work with oils. It has to be Viva. They are very cloth-like. You can also use old t-shirts. Those work too, but that gets pretty wasteful and expensive over time because you can't really clean those easily. So I just use the Viva paper towels. One paper towel really does last a very long time with these. If you're using Bounty, you're going to blow through them so quickly because of the way that the oil reacts to the paper towel. Like, it just soaks into it and it makes a mess, and it's terrible. So I've added some black. Now I'm going to show you how I'm mixing these colors, and we're going to get a headache from my camera angle here again. So I'm taking a little bit of the black paint. I don't need a lot, very small amount, and mixing that in with the brown. The one thing that you do not want to do is take a big glob of one color of paint and start stirring it into the next color. Notice how I came from the outside and slowly stirred in. You will make you'll just waste a ton of paint if you just scoop and blend. Now, one way that I've seen so many oil painters blend or mix color is with a palette knife. And this is another way that you just waste so much paint. You do not have the control that you need when you're blending with a palette knife. Blend with the paintbrush, blend small amounts when you're glazing like this. If you're working with the palette knife, you're actually painting with a palette knife, then fine, mix with the palette knife. But when you're painting like this, mix with your brush. So I'm using the Weber's Permalba black paint here. It is super dark, much darker than any of the other black paints that I've used to date. And it comes in a huge tube that will last you forever. But I'm just blocking in where I want my dark areas now. Again, letting my brush strokes show. If I get too much paint on there, I can wipe it off on a paper towel and then continue working. Or if I have too much black, I can wipe that off. I don't have to rinse it constantly. I rarely wash my brushes or use paint thinner while I'm painting. I use them at the end when I'm cleaning up, but for the most part, I just use a fresh brush, or I wipe it off and use the same brush for a similar color. I usually will have two brushes. In this case, I'm using this filbert. I will have one brush that I'm using for my lighter colors, and then one brush where I've got black mixed in with it. That you don't have to constantly clean your brushes as you work, as long as you're wiping them off on that paper towel. And to wipe it off, you're just pinching it into the paper towel and pulling it out, if that makes any sense. Now here with my shelf, I want to make sure that my lines are pretty horizontal. I don't want to start doing the vertical lines like I'm doing in the background, or the diagonals. Now if you get an area like that, that big black glob I got on my apple, no big deal. I'm going to take a little bit of a paper towel and wipe that off, and that will just blend into the shadow that's going to be on the apple. If I really want that black completely off, I can take a bit of paint thinner with that paper towel, or a Q-tip. A Q-tip will give you more control, and I can wipe that off. So now I'm using that bot brush again, and you can see I'm getting rid of my brush strokes here. You can still see some of the strokes. I'm just softening them out. I don't want to lose all the texture. Now, this is one of the biggest mistakes people make when working in oils. Because it stays wet, they get excited about blending, and they blend and blend and blend, and they never stop, and they end up blending out all of their values so they only have one solid mess of color instead of my brown and the black like what I want here. Don't overblend. Blend until, 2, 3, 4 brush strokes with that mop brush, and then stop for any given area. You don't want to keep reworking the same again and again. So I'm going to take this stiff brush here, and I'm actually just lifting out some of the hairs that shed. I'm scrubbing that in here, just lightening some of these areas up. I'm also going to soften the paint that accidentally brushed into the apple. I'll soften that up. It'll just blend into the color that I'm going to paint onto the apple, so it doesn't really matter. Now we're going to sit here and watch me do absolutely nothing. There we go. Okay, so now I've used a fresh brush. This is another Taklon, this one is a synthetic hog hair filbert. They're slightly more stiff than the Taklon bristled brushes. I've added a little bit of white in with my raw umber. I'm getting my base on the apple there. Nice thing with the apple, they don't have to be perfectly round. You want to go for close, but if they're not perfect, it's an apple. They come in different shapes and they get bent and bruised and all of that fun stuff. So you can see I'm using this brush to outline my leaf. If you need to switch to a smaller brush, feel free to do so. You don't have to stick with the same brush if you're not comfortable with it yet. Depending on how you hold that brush, you can get thin or thick lines. It's said that a good artist can paint an entire painting with a single paintbrush, and you can once you get used to the type of brush stroke, controlling the brushes. But when you're starting off, don't feel, again, you don't have to. If you're comfortable with a different brush, go ahead and switch. A larger round brush, something similar, they look like the liner brushes, but they're a lot thicker. Those make it a lot easier to get your edges or to outline things. Now for the edges of the apple, I would stick to the filbert. This is definitely an easier way to get smooth lines. Now if you're having a hard time and your lines are rough along that edge, add more liquid and more paint to your brush. Now the thing with liquid, there's no magical formula. Use this percentage of liquid to this percentage of paint. You're going to have to get used to it, and the only way you're going to do that is by painting, by practicing, seeing how much you want and how much you don't want. If you add too much, it makes it so the paint doesn't stick. So if I've got liquid already on the canvas where it's very wet, my next layer, if I'm still working wet into wet, I'm not going to use as much liquid on the brush. Too much liquid can definitely make your life more difficult. You don't need a whole lot. So I'm adding my shadows here. I've just got the thicker raw umber. Now, really look at this. This is ugly. This doesn't look good at all. Yours is going to hit this stage too. I don't want you to panic and freak out. It's supposed to go through these ugly stages. I mean, this looks absolutely terrible right now. Now, a few things about the liquid. It's going to do a few things. One, it's a fast drying medium. It's going to make your paint dry so much faster than if you didn't use it. Two, it is thinning out the paint. It's giving you a much smoother, thinner consistency. The next thing you need to remember with it, the more you add, the more translucent your paint is going to be. It's basically the equivalent of using water with acrylics. Too much makes it too thin and makes it actually harder to blend. Not enough, your paint's going to be too thick. But you generally don't need a whole lot of it mixed with your paint to get a good consistency. Now on that apple, notice that I was curving out my brush strokes from that center. This helps give you that rounded look. Now I'm taking this stiff brush. This has no paint on it. I'm going in little circles and just softening those edges out. This brush works really well for blending with oils when you just want to soften edges without going crazy with the mop brush. Now for the bigger areas, the bigger brush strokes, I will switch over to my mop brush and just make a couple of brush strokes there. I'm not pushing very hard with this. I'm just letting the tips of the bristles touch. Now, I do push harder than this, though, than I do with the acrylic. When I'm blending with a mop brush and acrylic paint, I barely apply any pressure at all. With oils, I do push a little bit harder because they are thicker. So if you're used to acrylics, you will have to adjust the pressure that you're applying to your brushes. Now this is where I'm going to wipe that paint off, just pinch it into the paper towel and pull the brush out. So now it's still got paint in it. I mean, it's not clean, but I've thinned it out enough that I can now add white to it. I had that lighter brown before. Now I want actual white paint for my highlight, and I'm putting this on pretty thick. I don't have any liquid mixed in with this. Or if I do, it's very, very little. It doesn't look like I have any though. Just a couple of brush strokes to soften that out. I don't want to go crazy. Again, just a couple and stop. Don't overblend. If you keep blending and blending and blending, you end up with just a glob of medium tone. You don't have any lights or darks. Now, one of the things that scares most people with oil paints is that they get that they're muddy. Everyone has there's this idea that with oils you're too likely to end up with muddy paints. The reason that happens, or muddy colors, the reason that happens is people don't know when to stop and let it dry. They'll keep blending and keep working wet into wet, and at some point you have to stop and let that dry. If you keep doing it, it just all blends into mush. So here you're probably going to want to use a smaller brush than I'm using here. The liner would be too small. I would probably go with a round brush. Now those stiff round brushes that I was using earlier, I really only use those for blending or occasionally for painting like bushes and trees and that sort of thing. But for the most part, you are never going to use those to apply paint to your canvas. They absorb too much paint, too much liquid, too much paint thinner, and they make a big, huge mess. You have no control with them. The only exception that I can think of off the top of my head would be when I'm flicking stars, but that's a whole other technique. But when doing bushes, certain bushes and trees, they work well for. But for the most part, you're going to want these smoother brushes, like the synthetic hoghair or Taklon bristle. Taklon are a little bit on the soft side for oils, but they still work. That's actually what I used for years until more recently. But I definitely prefer these synthetic hoghair bristle brushes. So I'm using the liner brush for little details. If you've not seen it, I've got the video that went up last week on how to use a liner brush. I'll show you how you mix that in with your liquid so that you can get these thin lines. Now notice where I'm holding my hand on this. If you're used to working in acrylics, you may be used to resting your hand on the canvas as you paint. You have to break that habit when you're working with oils. There are things that you can get, sticks you can use, small sticks, to rest your hand on so that you do have something more stable, but the paint's wet. Don't put your hand on the canvas. So I'm going to show you how I'm blending that again, and this video goes up on, or was already up, showing you how to use the liner brush. But I'm basically taking liquid and I'm twisting that liner brush into the paint, so now I can get that nice thin line. I don't want a big thick clump of paint on the brush. It won't give you the thin line. There's more liquid than paint usually when I'm using a liner brush. And my lovely camera angle here. Okay, go ahead and change. There we go. Now remember, too much liquid makes it harder. I've already got liquid on that canvas, so I don't want to use too much on that brush or the paint really won't stick. So that is too dark, so I'm going to wipe that off on my paper towel. I don't need to clean the brush and paint thinner. I'm just going to reload it with the color that I want now. Now, if I needed to go with straight white, then yeah, I probably would rinse the brush off in paint thinner. But being that I'm just getting a lighter color, I wanted a gray tone here, I can use the black that was already in the brush and be okay. But if there's black in the brush and you want to go to white, go ahead and rinse it or use a fresh brush, because that will mix gray every time. getting the little veins in here. And I don't need them to be exactly what they are on the reference photo. I just need to go for close. This is very much like drawing fur or feathers. Close is good. If you enjoy going for exact, you are more than welcome to. I personally don't. I want to save time whenever I can. But I do want to get the feel of that, so I am constantly looking at my reference photo just to make sure that I am going in the right direction. Taking that stiff brush and softening that line out. Now that stiff brush has no paint on it. Whenever you see me using that in this, those stiff round brushes never have paint on them. I'm just using them dry to blend out the paint that's already on the canvas. Getting some highlights in there. Now, again, I know I mentioned this already that I'm using the Fredrix Belgian linen canvas, but the type of canvas that you're using makes such a huge difference. If you are using a cheap canvas that you picked up at Walmart, it's not going to blend smoothly. The paint kind of absorbs weird, and it's got too much tooth, and it's just a mess. You want to go with painting like this, you want to go with a very smooth canvas. The Fredrix Blue Label Ultra Smooth canvases are also really nice, and they're very cost effective. What is the word I'm looking for? They're not too expensive. My brain just shut down. So I'm pulling out a few of those, making them a little darker because I don't want them to all be the same value. Remember, when using the liner brush, the harder you push, the thicker your line is going to be. Here, I'm just barely touching the canvas and I can get a nice thin line. That liner brush is a number 4. You can get a 3 or a 2 if you feel like you'll have more control with them, but you do want to make sure you're using the long bristles. The ones with the short bristles, you will not get as much detail. You won't have as much control, and they are ruined after like 2 uses because of the way the paint builds up at the base of the bristles. Now notice how, again, like I was saying, look how far back I keep my hand on that brush. A lot of people, especially when using a liner brush, they want to hold their hand right up at the tip of the bristles. Avoid doing that. Get used to keeping your hand towards the back of the brush, the middle to back. It may seem awkward at first, but you'll get used to it, and it'll make your life much easier in the long run. Defining my edges here. Now this is all still wet. This is all the same, the first day of painting. I'm just cleaning up those edges. Now, I will do a separate video on varnishing, but just to throw this out there now, you don't want to put a varnish on a painting until it's been dry for at least 6 months because of the way that the paint cures. So there are spray varnishes you can use to put over the top that are more temporary. There's a lot of temporary things that you can do. I don't personally even varnish most of my paintings, like at all. I am going to do a video again. I'll show you how to use it, or the spray varnish that I've got. But the varnishing was a really, really big deal back when people used to smoke in their homes and you had the wood burning stoves and that sort of thing. You would get soot all over the paintings, and so you had to varnish them to protect them. And the varnishes have to be able to be removed so that when they yellow from all of the smoke, they can be cleaned. Nowadays, it's really not such a big deal. I mean, yeah, varnishing will protect it more, but it's just not that big of a deal. So don't feel like, okay, I finished my painting, I have to run out and varnish it now. You really don't. But if you do decide to varnish it, you need to let it dry for 6 months, or be dry to the touch for 6 months. Most of us cannot hold on to our paintings that long, so there are so many oil painters now who don't varnish at all. Again, I really just don't think it's a big deal anymore. And if a buyer did decide they wanted a painting varnished, they can apply it once it's been dry for a while, because that seems to be the ongoing thing. Well, how do I get it varnished when I've sent it to them? I can't have them send it back because, you know, it got shipped to them. That's expensive. The varnish is, they can have someone locally do it for them, or they can do it if they really want it varnished. So I'm going to add my little specks now onto my apple. And those are a bit darker than I want, so I'm going to soften them with that stiff brush, just a couple brush strokes there. Now these are going to appear way too harsh with the colors that I'm using now, but when I glaze the color for the apple on top of it, it's going to tone everything down and give it a very natural look. So I've got this soft gray tone. Soften that out with the paint brush or the mop brush. So you can see it looks like I have polka dots all over the apple. It'll look so, you won't believe the difference once the color goes on top. I'm going to add some highlights on that shelf now, or table, or whatever it is. Now notice the back line of that table or shelf, how I've got it fading out, just that soft, soft blend. Up close, yeah, I can have the harsher lines, but in the back, I don't want that harsh line there in this painting. I just want it to be soft and fade away. Now I'm going to let that dry overnight. So now I'm going to add additional colors to the palette. And like I was saying earlier, I always put them in the same place every time. My yellows go first, right next to my white. If I were using red, red would go next to that. And honestly, sometimes red's on one side of the yellow, sometimes it's on the other. That one I don't worry about because those are really obvious which color is which. But notice it's not very much paint that I'm having to put on the palette. That is a teeny tiny amount. A little bit really goes a long way. So I've got the brighter yellow there. And the liquid from last night or the previous day is still wet in the center, but I will need some more of that out as well. Got my reddish brown color. And the lighting is terrible. I should have put up another light for you guys. But you get the point. Now when you're buying your paints, if you're going with the Winsor Newton, the Winton color, which is their, I don't know if I'd call it a student grade, it's their lower cost paint. It doesn't have as many colors as the artist color, but it is much less expensive. You can get a tube for like $6.99, and that tube will last really a very long time, unless you're painting with a palette knife. If you're painting with a palette knife, you will blow through paint like crazy. But if you're painting with the brush like this, the paints will last a very long time, and you're going to notice different colors on there where one will be $6.99 and one will be $13.99. Go with the one that's $6.99. When you're starting off, you are not going to notice a difference between the one that costs twice as much. There's really very little difference. It has to do with the pigment and the hue, and you're just, it's not a big enough difference, honestly, to spend twice as much. Now the Winsor Newton artist color, that's what I'm putting out there. That one is a turquoise color. They have more colors available, and the paint is a little bit creamier. It is a really nice paint to work with, but when you're starting, honestly, either will work. So normally I would put purple up in the corner. I've got my black, green goes next to the blue. So as I move around, I've got white, yellow, red, magenta, purple, green, blue, brown in the one corner, black in the other. Every time, this is always how I've set up my canvas or my palette. Now I know everyone gets intimidated by the idea of working in oils, but when I'm teaching a new student, I will almost always try to sway them towards oils instead of acrylics, because oils are so much easier to work in. They're so much easier to blend. As long as you're able to know when to stop and let it dry, Oils are a breeze compared to acrylics. They just blend so smoothly and so easily. The main drawback there is that they dry so slowly that you can't go on to your next layer right away. And for those of us who like to move through things quickly, that can be a bit of a pain. This is why I will do my underpaintings in acrylic. It just saves so much time, but then I can go on top with oil and get that nice soft blending really easily. And here we are watching me do absolutely nothing again. Okay, we're going to take a look at the palette again. I'm mixing a bit of the liquid in with my green here. And I'm also going to pull some of the turquoise into that. Notice how I pulled the turquoise from the side. I didn't just take a big chunk and start stirring into the green. This gives me so much more control on blending the color that I want. You can see I've got it pretty thin there. I've got a fair amount of liquid mixed in with this. But I've got various shades to pull from. You can see I've got darker green and it fades over to the turquoise as I blend. So I don't just have one big pot of the wrong color. When you start blending, if you end up with a whole lot of the wrong color, it is hard to adjust it with oils. So I'm taking this color and I'm going right over the brown that I did the night before. It's been about 24 hours since I last painted. Maybe not quite that long, but close. You can still see all of the texture that I had behind there. If you start getting little dots showing through, that's the dry brushing look. You need more paint or more liquid on your brush. And I'm taking this color and even going over the black that I had so that my black's not totally flat. It's still very dark, but now it has a tint of color, which gives you so much more depth in that background. So if I have an area I don't want that much paint on, I can take my Viva paper towel, just the corner of it, and I'm just going to wipe it off to lift some of that off. Really easy, very forgiving. You can remove, as long as what's underneath is dry, you can have something that you think, oh gosh, that looks terrible. Just wipe it off. So forgiving. So now I've added a bit of the zinc white into my blue. Well, not yet, but I'm going to right now so that I can lighten this up. And oh, that's way too light. No big deal. I can just wipe that off. I'm actually going to wipe some of that off on my brush, which I don't think you're seeing right now. And then I'm going to wipe some of that off with a paper towel. I wanted it lighter, but not that much lighter. And the reason that I went with the zinc white is it's fairly translucent. So it's going to give me a lighter blue without being foggy like I would get with titanium white. So I'm building up the texture in here. I'm letting those brush strokes show. And I want some areas to be more green, some areas to have a bit more blue. You can paint this however you want. This part isn't terribly important. I mean, you want it to be pretty, but you can do whatever you like. I've added a little bit of white in with my green. And all of the colors, the actual tubes of paint that I'm using, I'll have those listed in the video description as well. But if you don't have those colors, it's not important. The values are what matter. It does not have to be exact here at all. Now, one thing I will tell you, there are, I don't know what, yeah, we'll just call them cheap. There's no other way to put them. Cheap paints out there that are they come in kits that are just absolutely terrible, and they do not layer quite the way mine are doing here. They're a lot harder to work with, so the type of paint that you're using will make a big difference too. I like the Winsor Newton because it is pretty low cost, but the quality is still there. That Reeves or Revis or whatever, they're one that everyone shows up to class with that kit that somebody bought them, and it's like, we can't use this. This does not work the same. So I've added that zinc white for the highlights on the shelves. And you can see the zinc white has a very blue tint to it. So be aware of that. If you don't want a blue tint, don't use that paint. There was also probably a little bit of blue mixed in with my brush, so it looks more blue than it would on its own, but it does have a very blue tint to it. So I'm going to wipe that off on my paper towel. And you can see I've still got the dark color in there, but it's not, it would have been too dark had I not wiped some of that black off. The black was just so dark. You can see I'm using this filbert brush to actually blend some of these colors too when you're working wet into wet like that. And if I need to blend it more, I can either use the mop brush or that stiff round brush that I showed you yesterday. Well, technically today, but it was yesterday for me when I was painting. So I've got this reddish brown color. I think it's called light red. That one I'm blocking in just in a few spots here. I don't want to go crazy with it. I'm going to be using this red in the apple as well. So I've got this stiff round brush. This is a very large one, and I'm doing little half circles, just smudging that into the colors around it. Again, don't overblend. If you overdo this, you lose all of the color and you end up with this muddy mess. So notice I just had to do a few strokes to soften it, and then that was it. Can't really see that because of the way the light is, but there is a little bit of that red up there. That light was going off the page too much, and so I'm darkening up that edge to work as sort of a page blocker to keep the viewer within the painting. That doesn't mean that always needs to be done. It's just on this one I felt it was necessary. Just darken those edges so you almost have that vignette look. I'm using the stiff brush to soften out my other lines. Now because the paint is thicker, we can use these stiffer brushes for blending that really wouldn't work so well with acrylic. With acrylic, I'll use those stiff round brushes for blending wet into dry areas, but as far as wet into wet, those brushes I would never use because they're just too stiff. They create too many brush strokes, but with oil, they work really well. Okay, so I still have some of the green on my brush from the background. I've wiped most of it off, but I'm leaving a little bit in there, and then I'm mixing it in with that light pale yellow. That is very fluorescent, so I'm taking a little bit of that light red color and mixing that in to tone it down. Now, the reason that that's working is they're complementary colors. If you've got your green is too fluorescent green, add its complement, which is red. So here I've got this light red color, which is I call a brown, but whatever. But that toned it down enough to give me a more natural color. And I'm still very bright, but it's not quite as fluorescent as it was. This has a lot of liquid in it. It's very translucent. The yellow that I'm using, both the yellow and the green, those are very translucent colors anyway. I'm going right over everything, the lights, the darks, everything. I'm pulling that background is still a little bit wet. And so when I get brush strokes where I'm kind of messy and it blends into the apple, that's actually good because I wanted to soften that edge anyway. So I've got to pull some of those outside edge colors right into the apple to soften it. The edge on the left, I want that to be very harsh, but the edge on the right, I want to soften that a bit. So I'm taking the raw umber and adding some of my shadow, making that a little bit stronger. I'm taking a clean, stiff round brush, I'm working in little circles just to smudge the edges in between the green and the brown. So again, with the raw umber, I'm strengthening that shadow there. Got a bit more green now. And again, now I've already got liquid. This is still wet. There's a lot of liquid on that canvas, so I've got to balance that out and not use quite as much liquid in my next mixture of paint, as being that I'm painting the same day. That color wasn't quite what I wanted, so I added a bit of olive green in with it, which is a very, very muted, very natural looking green. I love that color, and that one I get in the Winsor Newton Artist color. It is a little bit more expensive than the Winton color, but it's a color I use so often. I just love it. That one and the turquoise are two colors in the Winton color that are must-haves for me. And I recently switched. I'd been using the raw umber in the Artist, or the Winton color, sorry, the less expensive one, and I recently decided to give it a try in the Artist, or the Winsor Newton Artist brand, Artist label. I am having trouble with words as usual, but I really do prefer the Artist one just because of the texture. But when you're starting off, like I said, I did the Winton color for years and was perfectly happy with them. So normally when you're starting, I have students, if the color's available in the Artist grade, go for it. If you've got extra money that you don't mind spending, then I think the Artist ones are nicer, but otherwise, if you're on a budget, the Winton color really are fine, other than the fact that they don't have as many colors. Now, one thing that you want to make sure when you are painting, cover the canvas. I see this happen so often where people won't quite go to the edges of something, or the canvas underneath is showing through little white dots. Make sure your entire canvas is 100% covered in paint. Don't leave a halo around things. Don't go so try to save paint so that you don't actually get the canvas covered. And that's true whether you're doing oils or acrylics. Make sure you get all of that covered. You can see I'm using this brush to kind of blend and soften my edges. It just doesn't have a lot of paint or liquid on it at this point. It's fairly dry. Now I've reloaded it with more of the olive green, and I'm smudging that out with the stiff round brush. And I say olive green, but it's actually olive green mixed with the other green. I want to say it was terre verte that I was using. I don't remember. It'll be in the video description. But it's both of those greens mixed together. There may also be a touch of the reddish brown to tone it down. But when you're doing this, if this is your first time oil painting, do not stress yourself out about having the color perfect. It does not matter. Get your values right. I mean, color is important, but not as big of a deal as everyone makes it out to be. It's your values that matter. So here I am using that zinc white again because it is fairly translucent for my highlight, and I will smudge out this highlight after I lay this in here. Again, notice that I did not overblend. It only took a couple of brush strokes and then that was it. I think one of the most common questions that I get from students is, how do you know which colors to use? Honestly, it's just experience. And unless you sit and paint and put the time into it, you're not going to gain the experience to really have an idea of which colors you should use and when. I mean, you can watch videos, you can watch stuff or read books on color theory, but until you've experienced it, it's not going to make a ton of sense. So just start painting. If you can get your values right, you can use total wrong colors and it won't be that big of a deal. But get your values, your darks dark enough and your lights light enough. That matters so much more. Getting your contrast in there really makes a big difference. So while you're learning and you're getting used to blending these colors, just focus on your values. If you can make sure that's correct, the rest of it will come with time. So onto the leaf, I'm using more of that olive green, and you can see I'm going right over the veins. I'm not painting around anything there. You can still see the veins underneath it because this is very translucent. Now, when you're shopping for paint, knowing which paints are going to be translucent or which ones are going to be opaque, most of the paint tubes are going to tell you on the back if you can read teeny, teeny, tiny writing. For me, it's just been experience. I've used them long enough. I know certain colors are going to be opaque or translucent. Like almost all of your yellows are going to be very, very translucent. Most of the greens are very translucent. There are some exceptions like chromium of oxide or oxide chromium, I forget which it is. That's one of the greens. That one's pretty opaque. And Naples yellow is a very opaque yellow. But other than those two, most of the greens and yellows, you're pretty safe assuming they're going to be very translucent. Yellow ochre is another one that is semi-opaque. That's the one that's sort of a brownish yellow. Now the big thing to notice here is that I'm not globbing this paint on super thick. That's what I see a lot of people do with oils too. When they first start off, they put it on so thick that the end result is like 2 inches thick. It takes forever to dry, which meant that their colors were all muddied and blending together as they were mixing because they didn't want to wait 2 months for each layer to dry. You don't have to add that much. A little bit really does go a long way. And when you're buying your mixing medium, if you're using the liquid, it comes in several sizes. I always get the largest one because that you will go through faster than you will your actual paint. Now, Winsor Newton does have a very small set that you can get for, I want to say it's $40, $45. Sometimes I've seen it as low as $35. But that one is a nice set. It's smaller tubes, but they really last a long time. It's not the black and the white that I like, but it'll work to get you started. I still prefer the Weber's Permalba. Again, that'll be one that I'll put a link for you in the video description. It doesn't have all of the colors that I'm using here, but you can get something very similar to that using that set. So if you're wanting to get started with oils, it's a set that I get a lot, or recommend to a lot of my students because it is so low cost and it is a great way to get you started. And those ones are all the Winton colors. Getting a few highlights in here. Now, one thing you want to watch, if you're using zinc white, I put it on very, very thin. You do not want to do big, thick chunks of zinc white. I think I'm using the Weber's Permalba, the regular original white here. But zinc white, if you put that on too thick, it can crack over time. That is one that does have a tendency to have problems as far as being archival issues later on. If it's thin like this, you're really not going to have issues. But if you're caking that on, don't use it with a palette knife. Don't put it on super heavy. Stick with regular titanium white or a different one. I just use the zinc white for glazes and for slightly lightening things up. But let's say I was doing a whole snow scene, I would not paint all of my snow with that paint. I don't want it on there that thick or that much of it. Getting the little details there. One thing you're definitely going to want to have on your easel are Q-tips. I mentioned that earlier, but they are so great for fixing little problems that you need to wipe off if you have a tiny mistake. You don't need to put paint, you can put paint thinner on them, but you really don't need to. You can just use the Q-tip dry and it'll wipe off anything that you've messed up. Just getting some of the little details in there with that liner brush. Now the contrast here makes such a big difference, so don't be afraid of it. If I didn't have the contrast, because those colors are so similar to what's in the rest of the apple on that leaf, it would just blend right into it. Adding a little bit of a shadow there and then using that stiff brush to pull it out. Softening that edge again. This is the one I was talking about that I want it to be slightly softer than the other side. That is it for day 2 of oil painting. Oh wait, not quite it. A little bit of a shadow there. Blending that out. Now that's it for day 2 of oil painting. On to day 3, I'm putting another glaze where I'm using a fair amount of liquid and a little bit of that paint just to tint the color, and you can see it's just brightening everything up. And I'm going over my shadows and the rest of the apple. I'm not completely covering the highlight, the main highlight though. This is one of those things. It is as forgiving as acrylic is. People think that it's not, but it is. I think it's more forgiving. You just have to let it dry. If you have a layer and you're not in love with the colors, let it dry and glaze over it or paint over it. The key there is letting it dry. If you just keep reworking and reworking while it's wet, that's where that muddy mess comes from. So I'm going to take that light red and go over the shadow here. And that color is just such a good choice for the shadows on a green apple because they're complementary colors. They just work so well together. And if you're not familiar with what complementary colors are, they're just the opposite of each other on the color wheel. So you've got red and green, orange and blue, and yellow and purple. And if there is one thing in color theory that you understand, it should be that blending a color with its complementary color will neutralize that color. So like I was saying earlier, if your green is too fluorescent, add some red. Or in this case, I'm using the light red, which is kind of a brownish red. Or if your purple is too purple, add some yellow. Now, if you're doing blonde hair, for example, a lot of people think yellow and white, that's how you paint blonde hair. No, it's really not. It's yellow. There is some yellow, but it's more of the purple with the white because they neutralize each other and give you that definite blonde natural color. You do not want yellow hair. See, I add a little bit of color and then I'm smudging that around, but I can still see the detail underneath. These are very, very light layers. There's not a whole lot of paint on my brush. It is a mixture of liquid and paint. Darkening up that center area, and then I'll smudge out the edges with that round stiff brush. Notice when I'm smudging out the edges, it's just the edge, the inside up against the leaf. I've left that harsh. I don't want to smudge that. I want that to be a sharp line. It's the outer edge that I want soft. And again, notice that I did not spend a lot of time blending, just a few brush strokes, and then I stopped. This is one of those things, if you're not sure if you should keep blending, make a couple of brush strokes, back away and look at it, and then decide if you need to continue blending. But keep doing that. It'll help you to not overblend. So now I'm using a bit of the Naples yellow. This is the more opaque yellow I was talking about earlier, and it really has good coverage. So for some of these highlights, it's a really great way to go. No, not so much the highlights on the apple, but the highlights on the leaf. I'm going to soften that down with a liner brush there. Working on my contrast. I've got that stiff round brush. And now those stiff round brushes, they usually will come in sets of teeny tiny to big, and you'll get a combination of the round and the flats. For oil paint, they're really inexpensive too, normally under $15 for a whole set. They're cheap, they fall apart sometimes, but for the price, you can't beat it. And it is one of those things that we use so often in oils. I definitely recommend getting the set of the rounds and the flats like that. You're going to probably use the synthetic hog hair a bit more, but there are certain techniques that those round and flats, those stiff, cheap brushes are just so great for. So here I'm hyping up my highlight just a bit. I'm using the Weber's Permalba white there. I really want that to show up a bit more. I don't have very much on my brush at all. You can see I'm using the brush itself to blend that out, and then I will probably be switching over to the stiff round just for the edges. Now here it looks like I'm using the zinc white, the very translucent. Just softening that up with that stiff round. This is where I just do the final details. Make sure my contrast is where I want it. Add little teeny tiny details on edges of the leaf. Any shadows here. You can see I'm adding a little bit more of that light red. Working up on that edge. Softening that down even more. Now here I'm working on a canvas board. One thing you want to keep in mind with canvas boards, while they may be more inexpensive, when you're working with oils, there's nothing to grab onto. The paint is wet, so it's really hard to move the canvas around. That can be a bit of a pain, whereas the stretched canvases on the the stretcher bars, you can hold onto the edge of the canvas, so it does make it a lot easier to control. When you're new to oil painting, I definitely would recommend go with a stretched canvas so that you do have something to grip onto. These ones are okay, but like I'm used to dealing with painting, so it's not as hard for me to work on a canvas board. But when I first started, I remember that was a real challenge for me, is not making a mess, because you'd go to grab onto the canvas, it would kind of move or flop over, you'd go to grab it and you've got a big thumbprint on the front now. If you get the stretch canvas, it gives you something to grip to or something to hold on to. Your other option, they sell the canvas pads, which are really nice. Fredrix does, and I actually like the tooth on those pretty well. You can get those and use masking tape and tape it onto a board. So the board is what you're gripping onto, but the painting, you're still working on the less expensive canvas pad sheets, if being more cost efficient is important to you while you're learning. So you can see I'm using the Q-tip there. That was way too blue, just wiping that off. The very last thing that I'm going to do on this, I'm going to go back to my liner brush and I'm going to pull in some highlights on the leaf and the stem here. I've got Naples yellow mixed with white. I'm actually thinning out part of that stem. That was too thick, so I'm thinning that out a little bit. And then I will come back through with highlights on the edges of the apple. Or not the apple, the leaf. And that is it. I'm going to provide this photo for you guys. If you want to paint it yourself, you can download it. There will be an attachment here on Patreon for you. And again, you can get this apple over at Paint My Photo. I forget who the photographer is. I'll link that in the video description as well. Let me know if you have any questions. And if you do try this painting, please share it with me. I would love to see it.